Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and we are back today with Amber Mehresh. Amber and I have been talking about her relationship with Nikola Tesla, who she reached out to for some help with some electrical projects on her house. And it turns out that Nikola and Amber are twin flames or twin souls. And there's a whole story about that you can find on an earlier podcast. But now Amber and Nikola spend much of their time exploring their relationship, expanding their hearts, using the power of love to shift timelines and history, and to begin to build our new Earth. And they are also bringing forth a more heart-centered world, this new Earth, where technology operates in harmony with the Earth and with nature and serves the evolutionary well-being of all humanity. And we're going to go deep into this today. So thank you for being here, Amber. It's wonderful to talk with you. I'm so excited.
Oh, thank you. I'm super excited too.
So we've talked before about your relationship with Nikola Tesla and how you work interdimensionally together and are growing in your relationship and work in that way. But I had a specific request for you that I asked you to go to where you are, like in the new Earth. And basically, I guess it's where you would be in our future right now in this new Earth space and find out what it's like. So can you first talk about where is it that you were visiting and how can we orient that to where we are right now?
Yes, I'm visiting the new Earth. And by new Earth, I mean the dimension and you could call it a place, but it's more of a dimension and perception of consciousness in which humans are the most in harmony with themselves and with nature. And by being in harmony with themselves, I don't mean just other individuals, but I mean within themselves. Like a person is very self-aware and you would say in a state of self-realization where they realize themselves in their own divinity. And so they are embodying their own divinity as a perfect soul. So in this dimension of New Earth, you can imagine that they live very differently from that perspective than we do here.
I would imagine, because when I look out at the world here, most of the problems that I see stem from an old idea of the human condition and human nature, and are just continual focus on things like conflict and competition and extracting value to hold on to personally, like in the form of wealth and things like that. That it's a consciousness issue. It's not necessarily a technological issue. So I'm very excited about our conversation because that sounds like heaven on earth to me to be in that space. And actually, I'm writing a series of young adult novels where the world is much more like that, probably somewhere between here and there, but much more attuned to being in a regenerative state, in being in tune with nature, and a different sense of what it means to be human. So if you were to introduce us to this world, what door would you want to open first so that we can begin to experience it?
I would start with the everyday, the way that we live every day, and the things that Nikola showed me when I journeyed to that new Earth dimension were the things like housing, education, the way things operate on a day-to-day basis.
What is housing like in that space?
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to make a point about one thing that you said,
Mm-hmm.
that about our basic human nature and how in the world where we are now, we
Mm-hmm.
have this mindset that humans are by their nature, somewhat corrupted and greedy and all these other really dark
Mm-hmm.
shadow things. But in the new earth dimension, they have a really deep understanding of the
Mm-hmm.
human psyche, and everything that they do, everything that they create in their world is in harmony with the basic human nature as a divine human. And so you have the human desires, but satisfied in really healthy, harmonious ways. And so it's not that they try to subjugate or deny
Mm-hmm.
those tendencies of people,
Mm-hmm.
but rather how to fulfill the human nature in ways which both support the individual and the society and the world in which we live.
Well, and that's beautifully said. How I understand that in contrast with how we live now, because we live in a state where our nervous systems are constantly being juiced with negative emotions and anger and fear and different kinds of things that keep us in that state of anxiety, basically. But that if you really look at how the body works when it works well, it actually lays out the perfect template for us, because when you spend all that time in your sympathetic nervous system, your stress system, you really degrade your body. But if you really begin to connect and support yourself through your parasympathetic system, your rest and digest system, your system of harmony, it begins to teach you from your own body level what helps to support and sustain that. And then from that, like if you begin to look at in the body, it's almost all cooperation and just enough competition to keep things running well. Whereas in our exterior society, it's like almost all competition that we focus on, and we don't really look at the cooperation, but it's there. And if we really began to pay more attention to that and to what moved us all forward in a state of thriving, like even a physical state of thriving, it's almost a path forward to that. And it's one that I'm really interested in exploring more. So it sounds like that's that where you're going to is like that path realized.
Yes. And in fact, that's incredibly displayed in the way that they live in the housing,
Okay.
because that the housing, like everything about their way of living,
Mm-hmm.
incorporates that sense of balance and that sense of internal peace and harmony with, with what you said, with your parasympathetic system, with your social needs.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they really incorporate that into the everyday so that it's not something that you need to seek out. So Nicola took me to New Earth and we took a train. It's like an elevated train
Mm-hmm.
out to, well, it looked like that we got off in the middle of a forest.
Ooh.
But yeah, but he says this is the suburbs.
Wow.
So I looked around. I'm like, this is the middle of a forest. And so we went to a what he was calling an apartment building, but it
Mm-hmm.
looked nothing like an apartment building. It was this beautiful building. It was, contained in
Mm-hmm.
some sort of glass material, which he said was not exactly glass. It had different thermal properties than the
Mm-hmm.
glass that we use here. So it had different properties, but it was this building was contained in glass. But you walk inside, and I still felt like I was in the middle of a forest. Like
Wow.
I walked down a hallway, and they made it really felt like I was walking down a forest path with
Mm-hmm.
trees, and the flooring was, looked like dirt and moss, and yeah, with little waterfalls everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So before you go on with this, so were you really like in an apartment building and this was a simulated environment, or was this the real environment that was somehow contained in this building?
It was a little bit of both.
Okay.
It was man-made in that they had taken natural elements and organized it in such a way into this apartment building
Mm-hmm.
to be a communal living setting. And so as I looked around on like the main floor, they had they had little settings around what looked like a pond and waterfall. They had, seating area. It looked like you were sitting on rocks and whatnot, but it was designed also for your comfort. So it wasn't just
Okay.
like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable sitting on a rock. And so there was a lot of little gathering places.
Uh-huh.
And then the basement had, this is my favorite. I keep like revisiting this with Nico. I'm like, I want to go to the basement of our apartment building because it had like the entire building like encompassed like this lazy river
Mm-hmm.
that, and it was all technologically controlled, so you could change the speed of the river if you wanted, and the
Mm-hmm.
lighting, so you could like set it with like really moody, dim, romantic lighting.
Mm-hmm.
Or if a kids' party is being organized, you could speed up the water and have bright lights and
Mm-hmm.
music and whatnot ever, played over your environmental system. And so that's fun. And hot tubs, and there's all sorts of water elements built into this housing complex.
Mm-hmm.
And then we took the elevator up to our apartment,
Mm-hmm.
and the and I'm like, where's the kitchen? There's like almost no kitchen.
Really?
He's like, well, some people like to have kitchens, but he knows me so well. He's like, I know you don't really like to cook. So why would we have a big kitchen if you don't really want to cook all the time, right?
That makes
He's like,
sense.
we usually take our meals as a community. So within this apartment building
Mm-hmm.
was systems organized of communal cooking and
Mm-hmm.
eating, which me and Nico, that was our preference. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
you could have your food in your own apartment alone, but most people were very social and joined, so every evening was, you could gather around the campfire and around the waterfall and eat together and
Wow.
socialize together.
Was the campfire inside?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it
How
was all
cool.
inside. Yeah, it was like you really felt like you were on a forest camping vacation trip.
Oh my gosh. So did you like back to the kitchen? Because I know I'm tired of cooking, quite honestly. I love the idea of the communal thing. But did you have enough of a kitchen that you could get your own food if you wanted to, if you just
Oh
needed a
yeah.
snack or something?
Yeah, yeah. He says some people, yeah, you can keep food in your own apartment and stuff. And the thing is me and Nico really like I relate to him so much. I mean, he lived in an apartment all his life
Mm-hmm.
and then went out and ate at the restaurant for like every meal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't, yeah, and sometimes he would direct the cooks to cook for him in a certain way if he was having a social gathering that he was hosting.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, he wasn't involved in the cooking and the day-to-day things. And it's kind of like that, very much how we live in the new earth, him and I, and everybody lives a little differently per their taste. But him and I, we have our apartment and then we go, if we're going to eat, because it's not required for us, we know how to live without eating. But if we're going to
Hmm.
eat, we generally go eat in a community setting.
Okay. All right. So now that you've brought that one piece up, I have heard, and I've heard of people and heard interviews with people who have lived for significant periods of time, months and years, without eating, and that there's a particular process that's involved in that, and part of it is kind of to be living in that state of consciousness that that you can be one with this process versus, how we think of food now as an essential part of our life that you can. But if you think of food, really, a lot of it is just light in different forms, light in the form of vegetables, light in the form of food that animals have eaten, all kinds of different things. So I have been well aware that there's humans that can live without eating. And how does that work?
Yes, because food broken down is,
Mm-hmm.
becomes energy, and it's the chemical process. A little bit of mechanical process as you chew your
Mm-hmm.
food, but then a lot of chemical process too, is the enzymes get to work on breaking it down and turning it into, the energy that your body is fueled with.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you don't need to eat, what you're doing as opposed to that consuming food and breaking it down in a chemical process into energy, instead you're basically connecting directly with cosmic energy
Mm-hmm.
and pulling that cosmic energy into your physical form
Okay, so is this something that
directly.
you is this something that you do like intentionally daily in a meditation, or is this something that you just begin to orient yourself to and it happens automatically?
Yeah, it's something that you need to choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I asked him about that. I'm like, well, does everybody not eat? Like I don't need to eat there, which suits me and Nicola just fine because we're so
Mm-hmm.
excited and occupied with other things that
Mm-hmm.
like who wants to sit still and eat?
Right, yeah.
And he was like that in his lifetime. Like he
Uh-huh.
just wanted to be in his lab and actually doing things.
It
And
really would save a lot of time if you didn't have to do everything involved with eating, from shopping to cooking to eating to eliminating and everything. I mean, so much energy. And in the body, digestion is like your biggest energy user next to your brain. So, or maybe it's even more than the brain. But I mean, how much more time and energy a person would have if they didn't have to spend it all on food? Like, that's my
right,
view.
right,
Yeah.
right. And in
Mm-hmm.
that dimension, I'm like seriously baffled that anybody still does choose to eat, but they do.
Now,
For
do they
for
choose to eat?
the
Is it for the pleasure of it?
Yeah, for the social
Okay.
experience and the
Uh-huh.
pleasure. And Nicola told me that not everybody wants to go through the learning process
Mm,
of channeling cosmic
got it.
energy directly, that they really just prefer to eat. They like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if they at some point choose not to eat, then there's plenty of people who can teach them the process of how to do that.
Okay. Okay. Well, excellent. So, what else in your apartment looks or seems different than how we live now? I mean, like the basic functioning things like
Right.
bathrooms and stuff.
Right. So first of all, the carpeting
Uh-huh.
was some sort of a moss.
Mm.
Yeah, that had been like particularly cultivated to, like, for example, not stain your feet, to not
Mm-hmm.
be dirty, and just the right perfect amount of moisture. And so they had like whole internal system for the housing that kept the moss, carpets
Mm-hmm.
watered at exactly the correct
Wow.
in the correct way. And so there were people who had studied this and perfected it such
Mm-hmm.
that we had actual, living carpet. It was really
Wow.
cool. And then of course the windows are those kind that you can, make opaque from the outside so that nobody can see in, but you can see
Mm-hmm.
out and stuff like that. And then just like like the bedding and stuff was all, natural materials. And it was very, just like earth harmonious. It wasn't like a bunch of synthetic,
Okay.
plastics and, harmful materials.
Mm-hmm.
It was all materials that were used that were in harmony with humans and with, nature, not going to produce a problem for the
Okay.
environment.
And you were also talking about like that elevated train that you took. What other kinds of transportation was there, and what were the fuels for those transportation?
Oh, the energy system is largely of Nikola's design,
Mm-hmm.
and um, my first awareness that this was the new Earth that he was taking me to
Mm-hmm.
was during a meditation, one of those hypnosis sessions where somebody
Mm-hmm.
else facilitated and then asked you questions.
Mm-hmm.
And in that session, I visited a power plant. I didn't just visit it; I was actually helping to operate it.
Okay. Okay.
and, and it wasn't. It didn't look like a power plant when I first stepped into myself in that scenario. I thought it. I thought it was a temple.
Wow.
Um, yeah, it was this beautiful building. It was like round, and I walked in, and first of all, I was dressed like something that you would picture like a priestess, like a tiara with a big crystal in the center, and then I was holding a staff with another big crystal on it. Um, so
Wow.
I looked like some sort of priestess, and the building looked like some sort of a temple. So you can see where I was
Mm-hmm.
mistaken. So
Yeah,
I
totally.
I stepped in, and around the perimeter of this round, like sort of atrium of this building,
Mm-hmm.
were these very large stone bowls. They
Mm-hmm.
they were like kind of on a stone pedestal, and then a stone bowl. And within the bowl, there was like seven or eight around the perimeter of the building,
Mm-hmm.
and each of them had a different type of crystal in it. And the ceiling of that building was
Mm-hmm.
some sort of glass.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was actually some sort of really purified quartz, not just regular glass.
Wow. Okay.
And in the center opening, shone through like the cosmic sun. It was a
Mm.
building that was sort of like dedicated to the cosmic sun, to cosmic energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stood, kind of in the center between in the center of all these bowls of crystals. And
Mm-hmm.
then with my intention, I directed the energy through this, ceiling of quartz, and then through the crystals that I was holding. And,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure the crystal on my forehead was also, I don't know, probably like directing my intention in a certain way, that I pulled in the cosmic energy and then into whatever bowl of crystals that 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 bowl of crystals would then take the cosmic energy, which was like a full spectrum
Mm-hmm.
energy, and then the crystal would, like filter out everything but the one particular frequency of energy that we wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were different crystals. So, if we wanted different energies, we would filter out accordingly. And then I would direct that into, I don't know, like the system. There was some sort of like little back room that processed all this
Mm-hmm.
and then resonated it out to the city community.
So this is building on that the Tesla in our timeline's idea of resonant energy. It's just in a very different kind of way, but that idea of of creating that, the energy bandwidth, for lack of a better term, that you wanted, and broadcasting that out so everybody had access to that energy.
Yes, it was completely
Okay.
wireless. It
Mm-hmm.
was just emanated out so that the individual homes and buildings would then have their matching system in resonance with that energy, which would power their particular building and whatever their needs were. And then within each building or home, uh, the person kind of controlling that home could then take the energies and also manipulate it. For example, if they wanted a more restful energy coming in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
say they wanted to sleep or go into a certain meditation, they
Mm-hmm.
could they could adjust their incoming energy
Oh, interesting.
and to make that certain frequency in their home, to make it easier to study or to sleep, or energizing energy if they wanted to be in like intense creativity or
Mm-hmm.
whatever their mood was. They could adjust the energy accordingly to match or
That's cool.
to support that intention.
Okay. Well, and that's something, from a hypnosis perspective, I talk to people about brainwaves because different brainwave patterns support different kinds of mental states and emotional states. And so you've got the fast brainwave patterns for things like creativity and then the much slower ones for things like sleep and rest. So it's interesting that those can be controlled in your environment too, and not just by training yourself to enter different brainwave states.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It supported your different brain waves and body systems.
Yeah. So then did every city or area have their own like resonant energy center, or were there different kinds of energies used in different areas?
He talked about it a very little bit one of the first times that I was going there.
Mm-hmm.
So the energy for it was zoned, like there were different zones.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like for example, the residential community would would be receiving a certain type of frequency as opposed to the the city center and where
Mm-hmm.
everybody was working and stuff. Like
Okay.
I don't know exactly how that works and all the differences, but he said
Okay.
the energy was kind of zoned accordingly,
Mm-hmm.
to optimize it depending on the intention for that location.
Okay.
And then every I talked about our like basic kind of tree house
Mm-hmm.
apartment building.
Uh-huh.
But I did want to point out that that was where Nicola and I liked to live. That was our apartment building, that was in harmony with our local surroundings.
Uh-huh.
But there was desert housing. There was every environment and every ecosystem has its own type of housing that's
Mm-hmm.
in harmony with that natural setting. And so a house or apartment in a desert community would look very different than our forest home.
Mm-hmm. What about like cities? Were cities the same way that a city in, like, I live in the mountains, so a city in the mountains would look a particular way versus a city in like the desert, or did cities look more like cities?
Every city did, kind of, it was unique to its surrounding environment. So every city did have like a different flavor and look to it.
Mm-hmm.
Although for the most part, I was really in New York City and didn't
Okay.
visit a lot of the other places. He just kind of really gave me an overview that all the buildings, residential and city buildings, were very much in harmony with their unique climate and setting.
Okay. And so New York City, they had, well, elevated trains make perfect sense in New York City. They also had, or have now, subways and cars and other things. Do those things still exist in that dimension, or is it set up a little bit differently?
Yeah, cars as we know them here
Mm-hmm.
do not exist. Roads and traffic as we know it here does not exist. Yeah, the elevated train, because you could have a train that's elevated and then on
Mm-hmm.
the ground is a completely natural setting with all kinds of plants and
Mm-hmm.
flowers instead of asphalt.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, there's not the roads. There are some walking paths, but roads as we know it, no. Cars as we know it, no. However, there are there is their version of cars,
Mm-hmm.
but they're more like little miniature spaceships, or what you would think are spaceships, but they're, Earth ships, I guess.
Like a hover car.
Yeah, hover cars, yes, that fly.
Okay. Okay. And well, because we think of New York as having millions and millions of people, all that need to go somewhere like now. And so it's always this sort of crammed full of people. Is it different in that time? And then is it the population different in that time, or how are people
Yeah,
organized
okay,
that way?
so I might as well jump into the meditation, which I visited the what Nikola laughingly called the financial district
Uh-huh.
of New York City.
Okay.
Uh, and it was not the usual Wall Street buildings that we have here in our
Mm-hmm.
dimension.
Mm-hmm.
The building that he took me, actually, I visited a couple different places. I visited the Historical Research Society. Yeah, Historical Research Society is what they called themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Saint Germain is kind of on the committee of that of
Wow.
that group.
Okay.
And that building looked a little bit more like, kind of like if you go to like the Princeton campus,
Mm-hmm.
or like the old stone buildings.
Okay.
But then like a lot of like the outer perimeter of stone archways, and then it had like this really green inner atrium. And so,
Okay.
and then like all the buildings that I saw have a green roof, like
Mm-hmm.
greenery and plants growing on the roof, instead of just being like a, you know,
Yeah, a flat cement top with air conditioning units.
right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and
Uh,
he said that a lot of the buildings as we know it,
uh-huh.
um, how, how to explain this without getting too complicated, because there's two angles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where they're living in their dimension, that is like the ideal timeline for humanity, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, and it goes like all the way forward and back. It's not just in their now moment that it's like
Mm-hmm.
their
Sure.
idea of perfection, but
Yeah.
like their history, is like the ideal human history.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, and so on. And so they don't have like the wars and stuff that clutter up their timeline the way that it does ours. And so there's that aspect that it's actually a dimensional shift, and not just a physical clearing out of the way that we do things here.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Well, it does
So,
make sense, but I do think it's worth talking a little bit about
okay. Yeah.
um, because moving, we kind of think, okay, so where do we get there from here? But there's not really a lateral step from here to there. It comes with
Right.
its own whole historical precedents that led to that state.
Right. So how to get from here to there is
Mm-hmm.
different than just being on their timeline in their past, okay? So it
Mm-hmm.
is like a lateral shift that we have to make to shift over to there. And so he did explain that a little bit.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
For example, we have our suburbs out here where I live,
Mm-hmm.
suburbs of New York City, you could say. And they're very urbanized. They're very, lots of roads, lots of wires strung up
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, cars everywhere, a lot of pollution in terms of like, old ugly buildings that really should be condemned,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. I definitely
Uh-huh.
not like the beautiful forest home that he showed me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so a lot of from our um, perspective, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the community housing and housing, for example, would actually be dismantled, and
Mm-hmm.
we would have to do the work of like cleaning up that land and healing it and
Mm-hmm.
harmonizing it back with its what would be its natural original setting. And so that would require a lot of like dismantling and then building up to become the new earth setting.
Right.
And he said in that scenario, some of the buildings would be preserved in their current state, depending on their cultural and heritage value.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would be made to harmonize as much as possible while maintaining their certain aesthetic and
Okay.
culture view. But a lot of what we know as housing here would
Mm-hmm.
be dismantled and changed into that new style of housing that's in harmony with the earth.
Okay. Along with the shift in consciousness that would allow us to live in
Yes,
that way.
that would require that. Right.
Okay.
Because you can't have the consciousness in which, oh, I require my massive mansion
Oh, yeah.
and nobody else get right, and I need to plow down this many acres of trees in order
Yes.
to, right? So
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
that mindset is different.
Okay. So how then, because if you're in a completely different place with a completely different history, what's the government systems like, and like the world, how do they get along from a global perspective? And are there nation states like we know them now, or are things organized differently?
There are, I would say, instead of like top down style government and direction,
Mm-hmm.
um, things are much more community and local based
Mm-hmm.
in their decision making and processes. But they do have, they do have people who run the systems. Okay, so the place that he took me in New York City,
Mm-hmm.
what that he laughingly called the financial district.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first of all, just to briefly describe that building, it
Okay.
was very rounded. There was like no hard edges. So it was a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful white building. And
Mm-hmm.
then again, it had the greenery growing off all the roof and the ivy and plants hanging off of it.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, the shape of it itself was very organic. It was kind of rounded with rounded windows.
Mm-hmm.
And then the inside, he took me to the office of a friend of mine,
Mm-hmm.
who I actually know in this dimension too.
Oh,
So
nice.
that was super interesting to see her over there too.
I bet.
So we went to her office, and there was like again like lots of windows and plants everywhere in her office.
Wow.
It was quite beautiful, and the way
Uh-huh.
the building is laid out
Mm-hmm.
is such that it wasn't just that a few elite get the beautiful corner office.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every room and every office in the place had its own beautiful view and setting.
Wow.
And so
Okay.
my friend in
Mm-hmm.
that dimension is what kind of she called a systems coordinator. And so she described it by just giving me an example. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
might be the easiest way to kind of describe the way that their city is operated.
Okay.
And so she said, for example, you have a delegation of, say, 100 people that want to come into the city for
Mm-hmm.
some project that they want to do here.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those 100 people, you require housing for them.
Mm-hmm.
They require food, which
Mm-hmm.
then requires also people to cook and prepare that food.
Mm-hmm.
And then they require, the usual amenities, and then they require clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, wait, why do they require clothing? Wouldn't they pack?
Well, that's an obvious question. Yeah.
Right? And she just
Uh-huh.
like looks at me, and some things that I asked her, I'm like, and she just like looks at me and like she's like, why would they pack their own clothing?
Oh my gosh. How interesting. Well,
And she's like, well, sure, they can bring a few things, but clothing is provided for them. So I asked Nikola about that a little bit deeper
mm-hmm.
after that meditation. And he says, yeah, if you're going to visit, if you're going to travel and be somewhere, part of the cultural experience is dressing like where you're going. You're dressing for that culture, to fit in with that culture and to experience the way that culture dresses. clothing gets to be provided for you.
Wow.
This delegation of 100 people, they
Mm-hmm.
need clothing, food, and everything that goes along with that. And
Right.
so with their, version of computer system, the
Mm-hmm.
message is sent out that we need, this many people who know how to, cook and work with food,
Mm-hmm.
to supply this many people. And so then not only is the delegation coming into town, but now they're coordinating the food workers and all the other
Mm-hmm.
support, the supporting workers to support that delegation. And so I asked my friend, I'm like, oh, do they get paid for that? And she can she can she can like kind of looks at me funny, and she's like, well, no, they I'm like, well, why would they want to do that? She's like, well, they want to do that. First of all, they are doing that work because they like to cook.
Mm-hmm.
But also they get to participate in the delegation. They get to
Mm-hmm.
participate if they want to in whatever that activity is going on. And then I asked my friend, well, what if that delegation is like doing like secret things? And she just like looks at me and she laughs and she's like, secrets? What secrets? We don't have any secrets here.
Oh my gosh.
So total transparency, right? No
Uh-huh.
secrets. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. And okay, so the call goes out like, we need this many workers. And for those workers, they're like, oh, I've been wanting a trip into New York City. This is
Mm-hmm.
perfect. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an opportunity for them to participate in the delegation if they want, or to come and do a tourist trip to New York City. And so they volunteer for that opportunity, right?
Okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
then their on top of the delegation whose travel and everything is being arranged,
Mm-hmm.
the workers' travel and housing and everything is also being arranged, right? And so
Uh-huh.
all this coordination of all these systems coming together is what my friend was doing with her, as her job as systems coordinator and
Mm-hmm.
her team. And so every city has like its systems coordinators
Mm-hmm.
to manage all, the people who normally live there, as well as the tourists and
Mm-hmm.
visiting delegations and whatnot, whatever projects might be going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so all of these are balanced through their systems management. You don't overtax the infrastructure, you don't
Mm-hmm.
overtax the workers, and things still get done.
Okay. So you had brought this up actually before we started talking, and it just came up again too. So you've got these volunteer workers that come in, but then you have people who have the regular job that they do, like the systems coordinators. But employment sounds like it's very different. So how does that work, and how do you get, the resources or whatever you need to live and that level of organization in this society?
Okay, so first of all, there is no poverty. Like poverty
Mm-hmm.
is just a completely unknown concept there.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has housing, everybody has food. Um, the housing is basically equal. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
nobody who lives in a massive mansion while others live in a shack.
Mm-hmm.
The housing is fairly equal, although the individual preference comes in as to whether they want to live in a forest home, a desert home, or certain style of building in the city, which is more modern style, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. They get to choose their housing, but the discrepancy in accommodations that we have
Mm-hmm.
here is like basically non-existent over there.
Okay.
And there's not a monetary system as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really difficult to talk about their monetary system without also talking about their education system.
Well, go ahead and combine those.
Okay, because when I asked my friend, I'm like, well, what if there's a need in society and nobody wants to do that? Or what if they just want to do nothing but sit around and crochet all day? And
Mm-hmm.
then like nobody wants their particular crochet work. Right, right, because it's
Right.
like
Yeah.
so unique to that individual that
Hmm.
nobody is really interested in that thing
Right.
that that person likes to do. And so my friend again like just looks at me all puzzled, and she's like, "Well, no, there's nobody that just sits around like that." And so I said, "Well, how do they coordinate what they want to do with
Hmm.
what society needs, with making a valued contribution to the community, to society?" And she's like, "Oh, okay, I get what you're saying. That's where the education system is involved." Okay, so
Okay.
their education system, um, the job of the education system is to take every individual child and
Hmm.
help that child identify their passions, their
Hmm.
interests, and then to cultivate those passions and interests into something that can be of value. Um,
Okay.
and then made useful for the rest of society, because part of human nature is
Hmm.
to want to feel valued, and
Yeah.
is to want to contribute in a meaningful way. And so the
Yes.
education system takes their personal interests and teaches them how to use that in such a way that it contributes meaningfully to the society as a whole.
Okay. And so is there room, like, I don't know if you know this, but like, say you get to a point and you're like, yeah, I'm kind of done with that. I want to explore this other aspect of me. Is there
Right.
room for that?
Right. I asked that same question. I said,
Okay.
well, what if you're like an older person like me and you want to learn guitar, even though you've not been trained or educated in
Mm-hmm.
music or any such thing? And in this society, there's always, if your interests lead you in a certain direction,
Mm-hmm.
there's always support to receive the training and the whatever you need to cultivate that particular interest. And
Mm-hmm.
so say I wanted to learn guitar, a guitar would be provided, but
Yeah.
also access to the teacher, to somebody
Mm-hmm.
who enjoyed teaching and was an expert teacher, would also be provided. So I would have lessons and the instrument and
Mm-hmm.
the complete opportunity to explore that interest. And if after some time I decide, you know what, it's not really for me,
Mm-hmm.
they're like, okay, well, no big deal, because the teacher loves to teach. They enjoyed it
Mm-hmm.
anyway. They enjoyed getting to know you and having
Mm-hmm.
the experience. And let's just let somebody else have that guitar, right?
That's perfect. Yeah. So then, so you've got this whole thing, which just sounds lovely. And when we think of employment, we think of, we work for, some people work 30 hours a week, some people work 40, some people work 80. It depends for what they need in order to buy the stuff to live. Now, it sounds like it's separated from that you don't need to work for the income to buy the food and stuff that you need. That's sort of part of how society is set up. But what is like a work, like how much do people work? Does it depend on the person? Or is there a societal expectation?
It really depends on the person. Like, for example,
Hmm.
Nikola,
Hmm.
loves to work.
Right. Yeah.
Like he could just like do that all day long. He could work on his, energy studies and his energy devices, and then coordinating it with the technology of others.
Hmm.
And so he could just do that all day long till the cows come home, and he would be happy as a clam. But not everybody is like him.
Yeah.
Nobody is forced for
Okay.
there's no compulsion in this
Okay.
dimension. People do what they want to do, and they find ways to the what their interest is and what they want to do also
Hmm.
happens to support their community. It certainly does not detract from the harmony or community. They don't do things that are out of harmony or out of
Hmm.
balance. And
Sure.
people are so self-aware
Hmm.
there that they actually, I use the example of, what if you want to study guitar? but people are so self-aware that they really are honed in on their personal interests and stuff
Mm-hmm.
much more clearly than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be pretty strange, actually, in their perspective, to have a sudden interest in the guitar and then drop it again because you found out it just wasn't for you.
Right, right.
That would be really unusual.
Okay. So in our modern society, when we think about what is the meaning of our life, what is the point of life? That's a big one. What is it? There's different answers. Like there's one is just simply to make enough money to live all until you keel over. And some of it is like to be able to, win whatever this game is that we're playing in the world. But there's always some form of lack mentality with that, like that somehow there's something that I'm achieving that I don't have now in my life, is the pursuit of filling that lack. Now it sounds like that doesn't exist in this world. So what when people think about the purpose of their life or the rhythm of their life or what brings them real joy in life, is it simply the living of life, or is there another kind of, I guess, ideal there that people are operating under?
One thing that is really, internal motivation of people
Mm-hmm.
there is connection, is
Okay.
connection with others, connection with themselves and their own, multidimensional selves. Um, and the thing is here it's a little bit challenging for us to envision because our society here really revolves around the making of money.
Yes, almost
And so we
exclusively.
we think that we have our entertainments and
Mm-hmm.
our leisure and our luxury activities, but really our lives revolve around trying to make money,
Mm-hmm.
or for the extremely wealthy, how to spend that money. And when that's off the table, the creativity of games and
Mm-hmm.
interactions
Mm-hmm.
is vastly more than if you have to, what you said, work an 80-hour week.
Right.
You don't have time to be creative about how to play with your kids, and you're
Right.
just trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
The opportunity for trying new things and for going places and taking trips
Mm-hmm.
and tourism and visiting other cultures and having experiences is vastly more. And also, I didn't even get to the spaceport and aliens yet. So,
Oh,
I mean,
well,
there's those interesting beings that humans get to interact with as well. So there's like a lot to do there
uh-huh.
that simply just does not exist in our society because we don't have time. We're too busy making money.
I know. I was talking with somebody, listening to somebody, and doing some research on how much time we spend. I say waste. I just didn't use that word. Focusing on money, and how much time, effort, and energy we would free up, and nervous system bandwidth we would free up if we were not focused on money, because almost all of the focus on money is a stress focus. It amps up the stress system. How do we make it? Do we have enough? Can we pay the bills? If we want to do this, how do I make more money? And how do I pay back my loans? How do I save for the future? Am I going to have enough money for retirement? I mean, everything is so focused on that one thing, and it takes so much of our effort and energy, that you're right. If we freed up that one thing where money did not become the mediator for all of life, what could we create? And who would we be, and how would we live our lives? It's actually something I'm exploring in my writing, but it's the more I explore it in writing, the more I look at our society and go, really? Like, we're choosing to waste our time like this? I can't even
Right.
imagine it. All right, so maybe we'll have to have another conversation on the aliens, because I'm all over that, and we don't really have time for that. But I do want to ask you two specific questions that you may or may not know
Mhm.
the answer to. So the first one is, in our society now, we've got somewhere north of 8 billion people on the planet. And do you happen to know approximately what the population of Earth is in that dimension?
Ooh, I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. And everywhere I went, like I was in New York City there, and it wasn't like I saw massive crowds. I saw a handful of people,
Mm-hmm.
but never like the hordes of crowds and difficulty.
Yeah.
Me and Nicola took the train a lot from place to place,
Uh-huh.
and we didn't have any difficulty just hopping on and off, being too crowded or whatever, like some cities in the world
Okay.
can get. Yeah, I have no idea on the
Okay.
population question though. I just didn't even
Okay.
think to
Well,
ask.
if you go in there again, I'd love to know. And then the other question is one of our huge challenges here that you haven't addressed. I mean, there's no inequality, there's, the food and everything else for people, but our big existential challenge of the moment is climate change. And it sounds like in this dimension, humans never made the choices that created like the human forces of climate change. So is that something that they just haven't dealt with, or like the Holocene era that we were used to, that we grew in, that we've kind of moved out of now into this Anthropocene? Is that still in play, do you know, or are things shifting in a different way, or have you explored that question at all?
Oh yeah, I'll answer part of it by I actually, one other part of the education system, I actually
Mm-hmm.
visited a couple what you would call students.
Mm-hmm.
But then I did very briefly discuss it, but I have not gone into depth. But they do manage their weather. They do have the ability
Mm-hmm.
to, control the environment, like the intensity of their storms and
Okay.
stuff. To do that in a way that's harmonious both with nature and humans, but they do have that ability to control. And they do know how to keep like the different temperate zones of the earth
Mm-hmm.
within those zones. So like if you're
Okay.
going on a ski trip in New
Mm-hmm.
Earth and you can expect that there's plenty of snow that year. Unlike yeah, I grew up in Utah, and some
Uh-huh.
years there just wasn't really that much snow, and then they had to rely on the artificial snow that they made in
Mm-hmm.
order to keep their ski resorts running.
Right.
They don't have that problem in New
Okay.
Earth, right?
Okay. Nope, I totally get that. And it makes it easier then too for agriculture, because that's one of the things that is changing in our current climate, is that our agricultural zones are shifting and changing and not as stable as we had anticipated up until this time. Okay, well, thank you so much. We've got other conversations coming up, or another conversation coming up, so you have to come back and listen to the next one with Amber. But I so appreciate you taking the time to talk about this stuff. I find it fascinating.
Oh, thank you for suggesting. This was a real eye opener for me too.
Yeah, it was a nice collaborative effort. All right, so you can find Amber's information on conversationsfromtheedge.net or under the show notes if you're listening to this on YouTube or Anchor or somewhere else. And thank you again, Amber. We are going to talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.